also been bothered. I was asked by the young people at one of the protest marches to say something, and I realized I had come full circle. As a preacher, I was standing out on the city square, talking to young people, and when I was about 18 or 19 years old, it was the first time I ever heard a Black preacher come out on the town square and speak about civil rights. And I realized on last Saturday that that's when my journey began, really. I was on a different journey before that, talking about blowing up schools, all that kind of craziness. And I'm 70 years old, and we're still where we are. And I realized why we are is because all those who marched with us in the 60s went home. And when they went home, they didn't do any more. They raised their kids, they didn't teach their kids. They didn't say anything on their jobs. They didn't say anything anywhere else. They were trying to get ahead in life. So we're right back here again, 70, 60, 50 years later. So I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad to be here tonight. I think this is a step in the right direction. It's just good to have it.
Thanks, Reverend. Hannah, can you be sure that Danielle's video is turned on?
Yes, she should be back here in a second. Sorry about that.
Okay, that's all right. All right, can everybody see my screen? Reverend Bailey, can you see my screen?
Yep.
All right, great. So I know there's some of you who have attended our sessions at the church, and we are obviously now trying to do this remotely. And as we talked about the next session, we thought it would be good to basically do a summary, because we figured there'd be a lot of people that haven't been on this journey with us. And so what I'm going to do is, just before we kind of get into the meat of this, just going to have us each introduce ourselves. My name's Dwight Yoder. I'm an attorney at Gibbel Kraybill Hess, and live here in Lancaster. Grew up in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Have 3 kids, a beautiful wife, and I can just say that you know, when you think of white privilege, that's me. I don't know how else to say it. I feel like I've had every opportunity in the world, and it's been really hard, this journey that we've been on with Reverend Bailey and Bethel AME Church. I've realized just how little I know. You don't know what you don't know, right? And man, white people don't know a lot. I can tell you that about the history of our country. And so it's been a journey for me, and it continues to be a journey. And I'm thankful that we have these opportunities to talk and look at the history, look at the challenges that we face today, have honest dialogue. I've enjoyed getting to know Reverend Bailey and Danielle, and just making new friends. So it's been a good process. And I'm thankful that we can have this video Zoom conference, because it's like I said before, oftentimes people will self-select to come to the church. And this gives us a platform to maybe reach other people that aren't able to do that. So yeah, that's who I am. Reverend?
Yeah, I pastor Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. Has been in this community 202 years, and I've been the pastor for 25 or 26 of those years now. And doing what we're doing tonight, I think God sent me to this community about reconciliation, even though people don't think that's what I'm here to do. And it's mainly because nobody likes to talk about what we're talking about. So, and I bring it up all the time because I think we have to take the elephant out of the middle of the room and put him in the corner where we are, and actually deal with it. So this is a good thing, I think, that's happening, and I like the partnership that we've developed. I think that's enough about me.
My name is Danielle Brown. Currently, I'm a principal in York City School District, but I've I've been in urban education my whole life. I'm actually a product of urban education, which is directly tied to the African American experience as it intersects with poverty. I'm also a doctoral student at Millersville University, focusing on poverty and technology and the intersection of race. I'm also a mother of 3 boys, and so this work to me is very personal on all angles.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. So let's get started. You know, part of the reason we started this partnership with Bethel AME, it was pretty basic concept, which is let's provide an opportunity to look at the history of our country as it relates to slavery, discrimination, what people have done to African American communities. Because as you know, this quote says, you have to know the past to understand the present. And one of the things that I've learned is we don't know our history. I don't know our history. And so part of what the focus is simply is to give people the basic understanding of the history of our country. Once you understand that, your eyes get opened to the world around us today. So that's the basic purpose, and we started about a year ago. We've had we've had 4 sessions that looked at different time periods, and like I said, tonight we're going to try and chug through all those 4 seminars in one night. So Reverend Bailey told me before we started, he said, Dwight, I think you might have a few too many slides. So I'm going to have to try and keep it moving. So many of us, or all of us, know the tragedies that have happened, and it's been heavy for me to see the news and feel the pain. You know, this notion of having a police officer put a knee on somebody's neck and then suffocate them is just incomprehensible. And it's really tough as a white person to know what to do with this, knowing that so much of this comes out of our country, our systems, our institutions. And, you know, I've said this to Reverend Bailey many times. I can turn things off. I can turn this off. I can turn the news off and I can go to the store and I don't have to worry about it. Black person can't turn it off. They never get to turn it off. So, you know, this is just to remind us things are connected. As we start thinking about the history, we had gotten through 4 seminars prior to tonight, and we're going to try and basically summarize these. And the way this is going to work is if you have a question at any point in time, you'll be able to do a chat question, and Hannah will forward that on to me, and then if we have time, we'll address it now or we'll address it at the end. And we'll also take breaks where Reverend Bailey and Danielle and I will just have some discussion about the time period, and they'll both jump in too when they have comments on particular slides. So before we start getting into that, Reverend Bailey, do you want to just lead us in a short prayer?
Sure. Father, we just thank you for your goodness and mercy that you bestowed upon us. We thank you for gathering us together tonight. Pray for what you seek for us, peace and to love our neighbor as ourselves. Bless this session tonight. Give you the glory. In your name we pray, amen.
So before we start on the substance, I just want to let you know that part of what we are doing, in addition to these large group presentations, is having small group presentations. And Danielle, do you want to just explain a little bit about kind of what we're hoping to accomplish with this and what's going to happen on June 17th?
Yeah, so on June 17th, I think what we've really thought about, the goal or the purpose of these small group sessions are to interrogate or wrestle with this historical information in order to move forward toward healing our families, communities, and our larger society. I think Rev spoke it best in his prayer. You know, the goal is to go toward healing, but we need to be able to wrestle and interrogate our own thinking and our own experiences, kind of like you began the conversation looking at Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and Floyd. So it's definitely going to encompass a historical perspective, but we need to think about what this means for us moving forward.
And part of the objective here is that you come prepared. So, you know, these larger presentations, you basically just show up and we give you the information, and we hope that you take that and dig deeper. If you want to be part of these small group sessions, we are asking that you take the time to read an article, and all this information is available on our website. And there's an article and a series of podcasts that we would like you to listen to in advance, so that when you come, we are all talking from the same basis of knowledge that we've looked at and studied. And I think that's really important to make this kind of these small groups successful.
Plus, Dwight, I think the other thing is that we don't want to argue about beliefs. We want people to think, because all of us have our own personal beliefs, and those beliefs, we don't know how we came to conclusions with those beliefs. So we're asking people to read, look at the facts, listen to people who have been experts at it, and then make a decision. What does it make you think? And how do you respond? How does it reflect on you? So we're not just coming and saying, well, you know, I believe X, Y, and Z. Let's look at this fact, because I think Dwight said it correctly. We've all been miseducated, and we need to be able to understand that and break through that mess that's in our head to give us these beliefs that are just not facts. And so we want to have people deal with facts. And one example is the enslaved African was never happy being a slave. But somehow that's been taught us, and we believe that people were happy, better off when they were enslaved because they were so happy. That's just it's a lie from the pit. So we want people to see facts and then talk about how those facts affect their thinking and what are they going to do with those facts now that they got them.
And I want to just add one piece. You know, it's a lot of information to receive, so don't feel like you have to be the holder or the keeper of every piece of information that's been shared in order to engage in the conversation. It's there, like Rev said, to provide the facts, and it's a reference and a resource that we'll have. So you don't have to be the expert in order to move forward toward healing.
And that reminds me that I always like to give a disclaimer. I always do this when we're at the church doing these in-person presentations, which is, I'm not a historian. I'm learning this as we go. I know for a fact there's a few historians out there, and that always makes me extremely nervous, because I'm going to say something that's wrong, and they're going to say, Dwight, that is just not right. So understand that there's going to be some things maybe that we go through tonight that hopefully are pretty accurate, but I'm not a historian. I'm a lawyer. I'm learning this, and hopefully, generally, it's 95% correct, but I may get a few details wrong. So let's get started here. We're going to start with looking at slavery, the transatlantic slave trade. That started in 1526 and generally ran through 1856. 1619, many of you know that was the first point in time that enslaved Africans were brought to the British colonies, and the story kind of starts there. We get to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitutional Convention. While the slave trade is technically prohibited, slavery itself continues until the 13th Amendment is adopted. So what was the transatlantic slave trade? Basically, It started in Europe, where there were manufactured goods, went to Africa, which were then traded for enslaved Africans that were captured. Then the Middle Passage was when they were put on boats and taken over to North America. And at North America, they were then traded for goods, and the ships would then return to Europe. What you're seeing here is a design for a boat. If you look closely, you will see that those are human beings. So these boats were designed intentionally to maximize the carrying capacity of enslaved Africans. It's grotesque. I don't know how else to say it, to think that that was what the ship was designed for, but that's what it was designed for. This is just going to be a little video clip of what it was like coming over on a slave ship.
The thing that distinguishes slavery in Africa from Atlantic slavery is race. Europeans set in motion a system of slavery that was predicated on the idea that certain people were marked as enslavable.
We've learned a great deal about the Middle Passage in the last 40 years or so. The volume of the trade involved the removal of about 12.5 million people from the African continent.
The Middle Passage was the middle leg of a voyage that starts in Europe. The first passage is from Europe to Africa. The Middle Passage is the journey from Africa to America. And then the third passage is the journey back from America to Europe.
The Middle Passage could take anywhere from 2 to 3 months. Men and women were separated. Men typically were held in the lower belly of the ship. The roof, if you would, was quite low, probably about 4 feet high. So people couldn't stand. African men were shackled together, and they were packed so closely together in a spoon-like position. And they would stay like that for pretty much the entire journey.
You're talking about hundreds of people. You're at 120 degrees. It smells terrible. There are actually people dying around you, which has to be a traumatic experience for everybody on board.
Maybe 10% of voyages, we know there was some attempt to rise up, to kill the crew, to try to turn the boat around, to change their destinies. Historians have a hard time capturing what the Middle Passage must have felt like for enslaved men and women. It's a voyage that is deeply disorienting. It's a voyage to a place that you can't anticipate. You don't know what's going to happen to you. I don't think we have adequate words to capture that experience.
I know this ain't home, but it's where you gotta be. It's time your family pay kunta.
All right, so Reverend?
I think, Dwight, there's only one problem with that, and that is that you keep on putting the arrows to North America. More Africans went to South America than went to North America and were enslaved. And what they don't always tell you is that slavery was in Africa, but it was the same way it's in the Bible. Abraham had an enslaved person in his family, and when if Abraham did not have a child, a male child, and died, that enslaved person would be able to inherit whatever Abraham had left. So it's not that there wasn't slavery in Africa, it was a totally different slavery. And this last thing is that when those that were enslaved, many of them were people who had been captured in real warfare, just like the Germans fought against the English fought against the French. Well, you had those wars against the nations in Africa. Africa is a continent of 50 some odd nations, and people had fights between them. And those who were captured in the fights would end up being on sale, but little did they know what kind of enslavement they were sending their folk into. Just like Europeans sold their children and that were captives to Africa, way before the African so-called transatlantic slave trade started. I call it the European slave trade, and we need to put it on who was doing it. And so that's.
In terms of when enslaved Africans first arrived, we saw this on the timeline. 1619, a Dutch ship blew off course and landed in Port Comfort, Virginia, and essentially had to barter the enslaved Africans on the boat for supplies to continue their journey. And that's the first time then that enslaved Africans came to the British colonies. In the colonies, then, there were what we call slave codes. These were adopted laws regarding how enslaved people were treated as property. And here you can see one. I think this is from the Virginia slave codes. Massachusetts was the first colony to actually adopt comprehensive slave codes. This law here, this code basically says if you are an enslaver and you kill the enslaved person, there will be no punishment. That's essentially what it says. So just so people understand, these are the codes that were adopted. These were in the books. These are the law books. We move to the Declaration of Independence. Everybody probably knows, if you don't, about Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is coming from a man who enslaved over 600 people, 400 of them at Monticello, 200 of them at other properties. And at the time, any given time, around 130 people were enslaved at Monticello. So the irony, it's just hard to overcome the irony when we think about some of our founding fathers in the words they wrote versus the actions that they took. After the Revolutionary War, there was a document called the Articles of Confederation, and it was technically the country's first constitution. It was very loose in that it did not have a strong federal government. So all the states, and this is really important to understand as we go through this presentation, the United States is based on dual sovereignties. You have states that are sovereign, and you have a federal country, the United States, that is sovereign. And they work hand in hand. When our country first started, you had 13 separate states. Each state has its own constitution, each state has its own government, each state has its own court system. The country was out of money. The federal government, which was under the Articles of Confederation, couldn't raise taxes, they couldn't raise an army. And so there's this constitutional convention called in 1787 to draft the Constitution that we have now. When that was convened, nearly 50% of those individuals who signed the Constitution were enslavers. And the reason that's important is because if you are enslaving people, and understand this was done for economics because this is free labor. So if you have enslaved Africans and you can put them to work on your plantation, you don't have to pay them. And that's how you build your wealth. And it's very profitable. So the United States was one of the most important cotton exporters in the world. And why is that? Because of the whole slave trade and enslaving people. So at the end of the day, we get our Constitution, and there are provisions put into it that protect the system of slavery. However, there's a problem. One of the problems is the southern states that have a larger enslaved population since those folks can't vote, they don't get as much representation in any new government. So this 3/5 compromise basically says this: we are going to count for purposes of votes and assigning representation in the federal government, every person who is not otherwise a citizen, we're going to give them 3/5. And essentially it gave power to the southern states so that they could help control the federal government based on the number of enslaved Africans that they had. There are other provisions in the Constitution that protected this system, including the Fugitive Slave Clause, which basically said if an enslaved person left a state that had slavery and went to a northern state that didn't, they had to return that enslaved person. The Electoral College, we hear a lot about that. Think about it, the Electoral College, if the representatives from a state are based on the population, and the population is benefiting from 3/5 of enslaved people, the Electoral College essentially benefits those slave states. What was chattel slavery? My daughter and I visited Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, where John Brown had the raid, if you know about that. And they had pictures, it's a national park, basically, and they had pictures of advertisements from newspapers. Just take a moment and read this advertisement and just let it sink in. I know when we did an in-person presentation, Reverend Bailey has some of these types of contraptions. I'm not even sure what the right word is, but when enslaved Africans would arrive, they'd go to the auction block and they would be sold, and then they'd have to be transported. The coffles on the right side would go around the neck, and there would be a row of enslaved Africans, and they'd be forced to walk that way. This, folks, was brutal. This is the history of our country. These were the types of contraptions that were used in the process of enslaving people. As we move forward, the country is beginning to show some divisions. You have, and again, we're skipping over a lot of history. We're trying to hit the high points, but you have the Missouri Compromise, and there is this ongoing struggle within the country about slavery. There's abolitionists, and we're expanding westward. So the question becomes, what do we do with this new territory? Is it going to be open to slavery, or isn't it? And so Congress comes up with kind of these crazy compromises. Well, we're going to draw a line in the country, and to the south of it, then that's places where people can enslave others, and to the north of it, you can't. And this keeps going as we go westward. We have Bleeding Kansas. You may have heard of that. This is all leading up to the Civil War. Rev, did you have something you wanted to say?
No, I was going to say that part of the reason why America was able to expand is because of the revolt of the Haitians defeated Napoleon. And the Louisiana Purchase is based on that, which comes a little while before this. And so they were able to expand enslavement further west because of that, and then began moving westward. That's the only thing I was going to add to that. And that's a little unknown story that most people don't recognize. That's why Haiti is still treated so badly now, because that's never got out of the memory of the United States that enslaved Africans rose up and took their own freedom. And that fear of that happening in America, in North America, spread across not only the South, but also in the North. It's still lingers today. People are so afraid of an uprising from Black people, so they don't notice what's going on with other people.
You know, it's interesting. We've talked about this before, but so, you know, it's a little hard to understand the revolution and us, our country wanting to rebel against the British Empire, because really it feels like it was rich white landowners that were worried that the British Empire was going to take their land. Because when you look at this, when you understand the history of our country, the revolution seemed to be more about protecting those folks than really kind of the people for the people, the language that we always hear. And what's interesting is back during this time, there was Shays' Rebellion, which was this uprising of poor blacks and poor whites. And the rich white landowners got really worried, because think about this. If this is something about class, if poor whites and poor blacks rise up, they got problems on their hands. So part of what has happened throughout the history of this country is for rich white landowners to divide based on race so that poor whites don't join with poor blacks. And that experiment has been extremely successful. And Shays' Rebellion essentially made folks realize, who were the white landowners, that they need to adopt these slave codes. And that's why they did that, because now if you're a poor white person, you have these slave codes that you can use to push down black people. And you see this throughout the history of our country, that there is an attempt to divide people based on race, because if they are joined by class, it's going to challenge the power structure.
Dwight, I would argue that pattern presented itself in the last election, the last presidential election. If people were looking for where it occurs, I mean, we have a very relevant example now.
So one of the things that is depressing for me as a lawyer is to look at the Supreme Court and how they were instrumental in the history of our country and the protection of slavery. Dred Scott v. Sanford is probably one of the worst decisions the United States Supreme Court ever rendered. And essentially, it was brought by a black man who had lived for 10 years in a free state, returned to a slave state, and then went into federal court and argued that because he had lived in a free state, he should be free, and that he should no longer be allowed to be enslaved. The only question that was before the court was, did he have the right to go into federal court? Because only citizens have the right to file a claim in federal court. If you're not a citizen, you can't get into court. And the United States Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to allow you to even present your claim. You don't even get to come in because you're not a citizen. We don't even recognize you. And if you read this quote, it makes you realize that this ran through every branch of government in our country. Article 1, which is the Congress, Article 2, which is the executive branch, Article 3, which is the judiciary branch. So we get to Civil War, election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Understand back then, the political parties were arranged a little differently. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, from the North, was a complicated person. We'll get into Abraham Lincoln a little bit. Definitely not an abolitionist, but nevertheless, his election triggered a number of states in the South to create their own confederacy and leave the Union, and then 4 more states joined. So there was a total of 11. Those states surrendered in 1865. 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. We all look back on this and think that was an amazing statement, which in some ways it was. But folks, understand, this was done out of necessity. The North was losing the war, and Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He did this as a strategic war decision because he wanted to have the Black folks in the South join the Union Army and also deprive the South of their labor. And what's interesting is he didn't free all the enslaved people. There were slave states still in the Union. I think Delaware was one, there was another one. Those states, he did not free those slaves because he was worried if he did that, they would go to the South. So Abraham Lincoln's a complicated person, but well, let me tell you one other quick story, and boy, we're already behind. But so Abraham Lincoln calls a meeting of some of the Black leaders of the time to the White House, and they think that that he's going to talk about what to do after the Civil War is over, how they're going to integrate Black people and try and bring them back in. And Abraham Lincoln brings these folks in and he says, we don't think that Blacks and whites can live together. And we have a plan that we're going to start a colony for Black people. This is true in Central America. What do you think about that? And that was his plan. So the Emancipation Proclamation was a big deal, but Abraham Lincoln wanted to save the Union. He didn't necessarily want to abolish slavery.
Right, and just to point out, just the states that continued with slavery: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, what's now West Virginia, and parishes in Louisiana, which is quite interesting because that's the Deep South. And slavery continued there because they were not rebellious.
All right, so 1865 is a really busy year. We're going to get into this a little bit more, but the 13th Amendment, which ends slavery, is approved and submitted for ratification by the states. But of course, we now have a number of states that aren't part of the Union anymore. Just a reminder, to adopt an amendment, 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate have to approve it, and then 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. Lincoln dies on April 15th, 1865, and Andrew Johnson is sworn in as the new president. So that ends our first seminar series. That was a quick overview. Reverend Bailey, Danielle, anything you want to add?
No, I'm fine.
All right, let's keep moving. So Reconstruction is a fascinating time period. And it lasted for about 12, 15 years. I think different historians have a different time frame. But essentially, from when the Civil War ends and Abraham Lincoln is shot through almost 1880. And it's the process of the federal government trying to reintegrate 4 million newly freed enslaved people into the United States. So the one thing that you may have heard of is 40 acres and a mule. And what does that refer to? Well, that refers to Special Field Order 15. So General William Sherman captured Atlanta in 1864 and then began marching towards the sea. And then his Secretary of War met with 20 leaders of the Savannah Black community, but mostly Baptist and Methodist ministers, and basically said, what do you need? What do you need as freed people? And they said, we need land. We need land. If you own your own land, understand, until this point in time, you have 4 million enslaved Africans who had nothing, no rights, no land, no property, and now they're free. So what do you do with that? And this Special Field Order 15 basically said, the government, the Union government, had lots of land from Confederate landowners that had fled. And they said, we're basically going to give freed people 40 acres. And apparently they had extra mules because the mule wasn't part of the order, but they also gave them a mule. This was a big deal. This allowed freed slaves, enslaved people, the opportunity to own land, to build a house, and to raise food and begin to realize the benefit of being in a free society. 13th Amendment was adopted, and it basically says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, and there's a little bit of an exception, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. So the 13th Amendment eliminates slavery unless it's for punishment for a crime. We're going to see the result of that little exclusion after Reconstruction. So Abraham Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, he is sworn in when Lincoln is shot. He is a unapologetic white supremacist from Tennessee. And what he wants to do is essentially get the South back in business. He says Congress in that during that time period would basically leave for 6 months. So Abraham Lincoln is assassinated April 14th. Congress leaves in May. Andrew Johnson begins what's called presidential reconstruction. He essentially says the states will be allowed to be readmitted that succeeded into the Union as long as they ratify the 13th Amendment, and anybody who served in the Confederate Army would need to get a pardon from him. And that was essentially what he requested. He also repealed Field Order 15, so all of those promises made to freed people, their land was returned back to the white landowners. By December, now remember, we've had how many generations of slavery? From May of 1865 to December of 1865, Andrew Johnson says, okay, Southern states, you adopt the 13th Amendment, ask me for some pardons, we're going to readmit you back in, everything's good. What do the Southern states do? They say, all right, here we go, and they start enacting restrictive black codes that essentially limit all of the rights that a normal person would have, somebody who is a full citizen. They limit those rights to the freed, enslaved folks. So it almost feels like Reconstruction ended before it even started. Thaddeus Stevens is our hometown, I don't know if hero is the right word, but obviously he's a major historic figure. And Congress returns, and the radical Republicans, as they were referred to, say, wait a second, we just fought a civil war, 600,000 people died. Mr. President, this is not what we fought this war for. We need to change the fabric of Southern society. And there's this interesting moment. So they come back into session in December, and these Confederate folks that were now reelected show up to be seated in Congress, and the radical Republicans refuse to seat them. And this begins a big tug of war between Congress, who is interested in making meaningful reform, and oftentimes Reconstruction is called the second founding, because it's during this time when we actually changed our Constitution in a way that gave certain rights to all citizens. So they refused to seat the members. They passed the 14th Amendment. So there's 3 Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th. They begin to adopt laws to protect the rights of Black people. Johnson vetoes them, they override the veto. The 14th Amendment. So many of you may have heard of birthright citizenship. Where did that come from? That's been in the political discourse over the last few years. That was inserted in the 14th Amendment. Why? Because of this U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott. It basically says, if you were born here, you are a citizen. Guarantees you citizenship if you're born here. So that means every freed person who was born here is now a full citizen. It also protects against states. So remember, the Bill of Rights and the federal Constitution essentially govern the federal government, and they control and limit the rights of the federal government. The 10th Amendment basically says any powers that are not given to the federal government are reserved to the states. So until this point, the states have a lot of authority to regulate their own affairs. And they did that. They had passed all these laws and codes that restricted what Black people could do. So the 14th Amendment said, we are amending our Constitution, and we're going to say that no state can make or enforce any law that will abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, and they cannot deprive anybody of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This was all part of Reconstruction to try and reintegrate freed people into this country and give them the rights and the protection.
But this is also where, Dwight, where so many people missed the boat. Africans have been fighting in America for the Constitution to do what it says it's supposed to do. And this is this 14th Amendment came into place. Everybody talks about how much it did for African Americans. They forget about how many immigrants, children, others who were born in America, more than African Americans have benefited from this 14th Amendment. And usually we hold it up as something that was just for Black people. There was a whole lot of white people, a whole lot of other people who were born here, were not citizens until this 14th Amendment was passed. And the fighting for civil rights that Black folk have done down through the history has always benefited other people, way more than it's ever benefited us, because we were always the smallest group. And that's what people don't teach that. So people don't understand the value of the 14th Amendment, what it means, not only for Black people, but for themselves as well.
Yeah, there's no question when you look at the Supreme Court cases, the 14th Amendment has become the most important amendment to the Constitution, and that was all because of Reconstruction and fighting for the rights of freed Black people. There was a strong backlash. Black codes, convict leasing, white violence, domestic terrorism. This is not like something that easily happened. So in response to that, the federal government pursues what's called military reconstruction. The federal government actually sends in federal troops to oversee Reconstruction because these states are not complying. And the Reconstruction Act of 1867 essentially divided the southern states into 5 military districts, and the U.S. Army oversaw those states, required them to adopt new state constitutions, required them to ratify the 14th Amendment before they would be readmitted into the Union. Ulysses Grant then is elected president, and he continues. He wins by 306,000 votes, and he gets 700,000 votes from Black men. He's reelected in 1872, and he continues with a federal government oversight to be sure that the states in the South are allowing the full integration of freed people. The 15th Amendment says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This does not guarantee the right to vote. And this is really important, and you will see why. But the 15th Amendment is important because the 13th Amendment just ended slavery. It gave no rights to freed people, no rights. So you couldn't enter a contract, you couldn't hold property, you couldn't serve on a jury, you had no right. You just were no longer enslaved. The 14th Amendment began to give you rights of a citizen, and the 15th Amendment said, states cannot prohibit you from voting based on your race. Now, the states will get around that. Reconstruction represents a time of great progress, Black political power. There's progress made in terms of the education system, welfare systems. In essence, for 10 years, we saw what a real democracy could look like. And it was really pretty amazing. Unfortunately, it's not going to last. And
you may want to go back to that last screen and see that at the bottom, I think you skipped over that. The bottom says it benefited
right.
poor whites and whites without land. Reconstruction era was an amazing era, not just for Black people, for whites, especially those in many areas. There was no public education, and people pushed for public education, not only for former enslaved Africans, because education was very important to the enslaved Africans. So important that they did it at their churches while they were punished for learning how to read and write. So after freedom came, people wanted to be educated, and not only they were educated, but many poor whites would not have public schools if it wasn't for a push that happened during the Reconstruction.
Yeah, that's a really good point. During this time, the systems and progress that were made were not limited to just Black people. And it's the irony. Think about this. These folks were enslaved, yet when they get their freedom, what do? They don't just look out for themselves, they look out for everyone. So it was a pretty amazing time, a lot of hope. The country maybe is finally moving forward in a way that it can reconcile its history. Then, unfortunately, there is a presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. Rutherford B. Hayes is a Republican, so you would think he would be more in support of the Reconstruction. Samuel Tilden's a Democrat. It appears that the Democrat has won, Samuel Tilden. He's won the popular vote, and there's 2 or 3 states that are being disputed. Sound familiar? And essentially, it comes down to a backroom deal. And this is the backroom deal. Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina were the 3 states that were disputed. And these states, their electors get together and they say, listen, we will put our electors to Rutherford B. Hayes as long as he agrees to withdraw the federal troops and stop Reconstruction. So let that sink in. Reconstruction ends because of a backroom deal that allowed somebody to become president and then returned the southern states to essentially their own ability to adopt laws. And we're going to move into the next piece of this. But it's just really heart-wrenching to understand that this is how it ended. I think I'm going to skip this just because we're running out of time. And let's just take a break here. Reverend Bailey, Danielle, any comments?
Just a comment about the Reconstruction piece and the establishment of public school systems. Because it's so, if you look at our current context, which I had when I introduced myself earlier, I said that I'm looking at the intersection between race and poverty. Right now in the United States, most of our schools are isolated by African American students living in poverty. So it's there. You see the irony again, and I don't know that that's a fast fact that people are aware of, but that is what's happened in our school systems.
And the sad thing about it, all kids have suffered because of it. We are losing our educational preeminence in the world. Every year we're dropping, and part of it is because we're not willing to educate all children. We're still trying to, what ends up happening, we dumb down children that we educate. And so it's a bad problem, and people just won't get it right. That you just cannot educate some and not educate others. Thinking you're going to still be at the forefront of every nation. Why we were at the forefront of every nation is because of our educational system. Even a segregated system was better than what we have today, because people were still learning the segregated systems. Now we have people in integrated systems, where people are still moving people out of the schools, and our children are failing because of it. So that's a place where we really have to work at, because if we don't educate our children, if we don't become the #1 nation again in education, we're going to be in trouble.
So we're going to go to the third seminar now, and this is the Jim Crow era. This takes us from post-Reconstruction up through the start of the Civil Rights Movement. We're going to just talk about some key points. First of all, here we are back at the United States Supreme Court, Plessy v. Ferguson. This is a case that basically said that the states could have separate facilities and accommodations as long as they were, quote, equal, and that did not violate the 14th Amendment. So part of the frustration that I have is we just went through Reconstruction. We went through this incredible process of amending our Constitution, the second founding. We got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And now the United States Supreme Court is chipping away at it. It's basically developing loopholes to get around the very amendments that were there in the first place to protect Black people and give them the rights that they deserve and should be guaranteed. So if you have separate but equal, that gives the states a green light to do all kinds of things. One other thing, so our country is based on the concept of voting, right? It all comes back to voting. Who you elect, how laws are made, how judges are appointed, it all comes back to voting. During Reconstruction, there were hundreds, thousands of Black men that were elected to state and federal office because they were open, the voting was opened up. So what you are going to see throughout the history of our country, and it continues today, is an attempt to cut the Black rights off by challenging the way they vote, by trying to keep them from voting. So what do these states do? They amend their state constitutions to impose different requirements, poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses. A grandfather clause basically says, if your grandfather voted, you don't have to pass the literacy test. If your grandfather didn't vote, you have to pass a literacy test. Well, at this point in time, only white men's grandfathers voted, right? Because Black men's grandfathers couldn't vote. So that made it only apply to Black men. These clauses were challenged, and the Supreme Court said, well, you're not prohibiting voting based on race, you're prohibiting based on a test. So that's okay. So what that meant is Black folks couldn't vote. Now, The South essentially controlled every aspect and attacked every aspect of a Black person's life. So marriage, these were state laws that said who you could and who you couldn't marry. Education, couldn't go to school. Black and white people, children couldn't go to school together. These are laws on the books, folks. We're moving through the 1900s. Public transportation, separate cars, housing, redlining, exclusionary zoning, restrictive covenants. This is the 1900s. So Black families couldn't buy houses, couldn't live in certain areas. You could put a restrictive covenant on your property that said no Black family could ever buy it. And then you could go into court and enforce it. Healthcare, we look right now at COVID-19 and we look at the disparate impact it's having on communities of color. There's a reason for that, folks. There's a reason for that, and you don't have to turn the clock back very far. There were two different healthcare systems. If Daniel's son broke his leg during this time period, he could not go to the White Hospital. Couldn't go to the White Hospital. He couldn't get care there. He had to go to the Black clinic.
Dwight, can I just interject that that's still currently the case? Maybe not in those extremes, but there's a lot of research out there that's coming out that is citing that we're still living in two different healthcare systems. When you look at the disproportionate amount of things that are prescribed to Black and brown children around just different things, something as simple as what we've labeled as ADHD, and how they're treated, and the jump to a symptom automatically as a result of just being Black or brown. So yeah. There's still research coming out citing that we're still in two different healthcare systems.
And I would say this, Danielle, Ritalin, which they give kids years ago, I don't know where it is now, but you could only find it close to Black communities. It wasn't being sold where Black schools were. I know that was in the 80s and the 90s, and Ritalin, which was, for kids who were supposed to be attention deficit and all that kind of stuff. But you could not find it anywhere else. And so medicine and things like that that have been detrimental to us, try to control our behavior, and those kind of things are given to us more than anybody else, especially in the school district. Today, we're more readily labeled as attention deficit than anyone else, and that's for Black children.
If you think about the Jim Crow era, there were laws on the books in states that prevented or limited every aspect of a Black family's life. I mean, there were laws that said you couldn't play checkers or chess with white children and Black children couldn't play together. So I hope people understand the severity of the laws that were on the books up until the mid-1960s that discriminated and pushed Black families down, kept them down, did not allow them to participate in our country and have the same rights that white folks have.
Well, the laws that are even worse, I say this to people in the South, Black people saw signs that said white only, Black only, and water fountains that said that. In the North, there were no signs. But I was raised in Huntington, New York, and I knew there were certain places, we had a lot of factories. You could not get a job, but the father would get a job. One of my friends, white friend, his father would have worked there. He was guaranteed a job there, and the grandfather may have worked there. These are unwritten laws. So in the North, we actually don't think racism exists because we have not had the signs. But it's had even a more damning effect on Northern African Americans, because in the South, when you saw a sign, you knew where not to go. And then when they came to the North, they saw no sign. They just barged right on in because Northern whites are so respectful, they will not say that they have any prejudice or racism. So those Southern blacks would go in places, we would say to them, hey, you can't go in there. And so it's a much more damaging thing. And I want people to realize that it's not only the laws that are on the books, it's also those unwritten laws. Some of the codes that are in the North where you could not buy certain property, cannot live in a certain community, and they're unwritten laws. And all houses would be sold, and one black person would move in the neighborhood, and everybody else's house would be sold, or for sale signs would go up. Those kinds of things. Redlining in the North, which is so often Northerners think that they're superior to the Southerner, and the same thing, same effect has been in the North.
Yeah. So I figured out that I had a little blinking light that said I had a chat, so that I had a question. So I looked at it, and there's a question here from somebody that says, who made the laws in the 1900s that blacks and whites must be segregated? Those were all made by the states. Those were done at a state level. So states would enact these. Sometimes counties and municipalities would enact these. I think in Montgomery, Alabama, not only was it a violation for blacks and whites to be integrated, but if a white institution allowed, say, a black family to come into a restaurant, the white family could also be charged. So not only did it allow it, but it prohibited for those that wanted to integrate. So it was all done at the state level. The one thing that before we finish up on this third section, I want to just, I want people to understand that we're talking a lot about the laws and the legal framework, but there was a big component of this that involved white violence, white supremacy, and propaganda. And we cannot underestimate the history of our country as it relates to those components of this during the Jim Crow era and the effect it has on us today. So I'm going to see if I can play this.
In 1915, the image of the Ku Klux Klan was seared into the nation's consciousness by the first true blockbuster in American cinema. D.W. Griffith's three-hour epic, The Birth of a Nation. Based on a best-selling novel, the movie portrayed Klan violence as justifiable and necessary to restore order to a South in chaos, while celebrating Klan efforts to keep blacks from exercising their newly granted right to vote.
This film so romanticized the Klan that the Klan pictured itself and described itself as heroically standing up for the oppressed white people, the dispossessed white people of the South.
The Birth of a Nation sparked a revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. The Klan's ideology of white supremacy and what they called 100% Americanism resonated across the country.
The Klan of the 1920s was not a rural Klan, which the Klan of Reconstruction had primarily been. The Klan of the 1920s was very big in surprising places like Denver, like Portland, Detroit, which had huge waves of immigration, both of Catholics from Europe and of African Americans coming from the South.
In 1925, 50,000 Klansmen and women gathered in Washington in a vivid display of their numbers. 4 million Americans claimed Klan membership.
That particular Klan also became very, very powerful politically. They elected at least 10 governors. So there were all sorts of public officials who were elected by power of the Klan.
I think it's just really important to understand that not only were there laws on the books, but there was extensive violence that permeated during this time. And so the thought of a Black family, say, trying to vote and going through the process of registering put at risk family, their livelihoods. And so during this time, essentially, most Black people couldn't participate at all in the political process and were essentially trying to survive. So from 1960 to 1970, in light of the Jim Crow laws and era, there was a great migration. And this involved hundreds of thousands of Black families leaving the South and spreading out across the country because they just couldn't live there anymore.
So many of them were came to the North. Many of them came to the North because they were promised jobs. They were promised a better way of life. Sometimes they were used to break unions and things like that. And people thought when they left the so-called South and other places like that, that they would find a better life. A lot of times what they found themselves is in small, what they term now as ghettos and things like that, where life had, didn't have as much meaning as it had in the South because they were agricultural people. So they grew most of their stuff, most of their food and things like that. And they came to the North and to the West and found out it wasn't as happy as they thought it was going to be.
Well, and we're seeing, Minneapolis, that's not in the South, right?
No.
So there's a question here about who was Jim Crow? Jim Crow was this minstrel figure that white people would dress up as a Black man as part of a performance and essentially portray them in a very demeaning way that was based on stereotypes and other characteristics that were not accurate. And it became to represent kind of the white people's way of portraying Black people in a very derogative way. Part of what happened after the Civil War was there was an intentional effort to kind of rewrite history. So there's things like the Lost Cause, which goes back and it says the South was justified in what it did. And that, they lost the war not because they didn't have the moral high ground, but because they didn't have enough troops. And it was, there's this whole process of reinventing what happened. And part of that requires that Black people are portrayed in a certain way to justify the treatment that is occurring to them. And so Jim Crow kind of represents it. It's shorthand for saying the states have adopted these laws to treat Black people differently intentionally to keep them down and to discriminate against them. So they're not going to have the same opportunity as white folks.
And it was so bad that Black people who were entertainers had to dress up in blackface and had to change on, make their lips red, eyes, white lips white, or eyes big. So even Amos and Andy were two white guys when it first began on the radio, but when it went to TV, they became Black folk. So even Black folk had to dress up in blackface and be buffoons, and they became very popular if they did that.
All right, there's a couple more questions, but I'm going to try and get through this last section, and then we will. We want to be respectful of people's time, and if people want to stay later for more questions, we're happy to do that. But I'd like to keep going here and get through the civil rights movement. Sometimes referred to as the Second Reconstruction. Everybody's heard of Brown v. Board of Education. Essentially, it overturns Plessy v. Ferguson. It says the 14th Amendment does not allow separate but equal facilities because separate education facilities are inherently unequal. Now, you know, Brown v. Board is a watershed decision from the Supreme Court, but it's complicated. One of the things that's complicating about it is the court didn't say how schools were to integrate. And basically, in a subsequent case, the court said, well, we're going to leave it up to the states. So the United States Supreme Court says it's unconstitutional to have separate educational facilities, but we're going to allow those states who set up the separate facilities to integrate them. The Southern Manifesto, I'm really curious, but I think we're probably at a point now where some of the participants were born, so we're getting into current people's lives. This was Southerners who were in the Congress that drafted the Southern Manifesto that said they are going to use all lawful means to resist the chaos and confusion of desegregation. They were going to fight Brown v. Board to the bitter end. I'm going to play this video.
The local newspaper, the Arkansas Gazette at that time, indicated that the Brown decision was going to change the face of the South forever. I remember those words. And I thought to myself, good, because I think the face of the South ought to change.
I will not force my people to integrate against their will.
The governor of the state, Orville Forbes, decided that he was going to use Central as his point of resistance. None of us of the 9 anticipated that the resistance would be as strong as it was. The night before we were to go to school, the governor called out the Arkansas National Guard, unbeknownst to us. And when we appeared at Central the first day, sealed off, the National Guard was there to bar our entrance and let white students go into the school. What it was like, it was rejection that I had never experienced like that. It seemed to me that if they were going to all of this trouble to keep me out, there was something bigger than my simply going to class. Only when we got home from school that day did we realize what an ordeal, personal ordeal, Elizabeth had gone through, and that she certainly faced more of the mob directly. I always applaud the fact that she was able to keep both her composure and try to figure out how to get out of that. We started school on the 25th of September.
President Eisenhower sends 500 troops of the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army.
It was a terrific feeling that President of the United States would send troops to escort us into school. I didn't know what was going to happen after that. It was like going to war every day. You had students who tried to use as much verbiage as they could to intimidate us. We had threats and comments that, we would be killed. For all of us, we decided that this was a year that we were going to support each other. We were going to try to do as well as we could in our academic work. Some were a lot smarter than me, but I also was determined that this year I was going to graduate from Central. The principal of the school told me at one point along the way that I didn't have to come to the ceremony. They would mail me my diploma. And I thought, listen, I didn't go through all this to pass up the ceremony. Maybe the world thought that after Little Rock, everything is going to be fixed. And one of the important pieces, I'm sure I don't need to remind anyone, that the history of slavery in this country makes it very difficult to overcome a lot of issues on race. We're a long way from being perfect, but we certainly are not what we were when I started out. I believe that our participation at Central is one of those many steps that's gone to change this country for the better.
I just add something to that because I think, and I had spoke of it earlier, one of the misconceptions is that the Brown v. created this integrative space, and it didn't. It's desegregation because school systems have never fully integrated, and while the states had control of some of those decisions, they left it up to local school boards, and school boards were making decisions that resisted the integration. I mean, down to if you look historically, when Ronald Reagan was the governor of California, and he had made this statement that he would support the LA Board of Education to fight the order to bus students. And this he was a president of ours, and during the time of this space when we're trying to integrate, he was part of the resistance as well. And so that's just important to note, that this is not something that just happened and schools did that. It's still being resisted. This hasn't happened.
And it's everything goes hand in hand. So if you prevent Black families from buying property, from accumulating wealth, from living where they want to live, and then you tell them that they can't go to certain schools, this is all tied together. And one of the things that I've realized since we've started this process is how everything's connected. I drive from my house and it's a all white neighborhood. I mean, maybe there's one Black family here and there. Why is that? You got to ask yourself, why is that? It's not because for some reason Black families don't like to live here or white families don't like to. It's because of our history. All right.
Plus, I think they bust the wrong people. I think it would have worked if they busted teachers. Because somehow people thought to get a better education if you're sitting around white people. And we were fooled by that belief as well. That somehow sitting in a class of white people is going to educate us, make us better. And it's a failure. It's a flaw, a fallacy rather. If they had busted teachers and busted some of the resources, Black folk would have done much better, because we were learning Greek, people were speaking French, people were learning musicians, music at the top of our field. And once we integrated the schools, you go to the schools now where there are Black students, especially in the North, you don't see any Black musicians hardly in the music department. And yet in the South today, you go to those F&M colleges and see those bands, got hundreds of Black students playing musical instruments. So if they had busted the teachers and busted the resources, it would have been a much better plan than busting the kids and sending the kids into hostile territory. And you have to worry about your kids every day when you send them out the house. Go to school, you don't know what somebody's going to do, like they did in Boston, overturn the bus, beat up the kids. You don't know all that hostile behavior is going to happen. It would have been much smoother if they just bust the teachers and resources, and I thought that sitting in a white classroom somehow was going to make me better. And that's a fallacy that even Black people believe. Somehow if I sit over in that white person's ice cream parlor, their ice cream is going to be colder. It's not. Ice cream is ice cream. So we just have not learned that. So I'm not for busing. I'm not for that. They were just give a fair education in the community that the kids live, send the best resources and the best teachers there, and we can raise every boat.
There's a question here about, why didn't they bust teachers, and what happened to the Black teachers? And my wife's a school teacher, and she helped me understand through a podcast that she was listening to about the unintended consequences of Brown v. Board. So before Brown v. Board, you had these Black schools with Black teachers and Black children, and they were actually doing a very good job. Just like you said, Reverend, they were teaching these kids, and there's great value in having a Black teacher being able to teach Black children because of a common shared experience, and also that environment can be supportive. Now, what happened is when you integrate, you close all the Black schools. What do you think happens to those Black teachers?
Well, I think just to add to that piece and just personal context, right? I'm a Black teacher, now Black principal.
No.
Yeah, so the assumption is that there was a better system, that the system that was set up, see, that separate but equal was a bunch of mess in the first place, right? Because they never believed that Blacks had the ability to educate and were educated enough to do that. And unfortunately, that still continues on. I mean, you have teachers who, teachers of color who are in positions and in education, and typically when you look at the credentials, typically they have a lot higher credentials than their white counterparts, just to be able to stand in equal footing. I mean, it was told to me out of the mouth that in order for me to move into a central office position as a Black woman, I'm gonna need my doctorate. And that was said a few months ago to me. That's the reality that we face, because we're automatically given the assumption that we know less, and so we have to do more. And so the reason why they weren't busted was because of the belief that they didn't have the ability to educate. We do it better. Come to us. And the reality was, it wasn't about us doing it better. It was just about us maintaining this system and this hierarchy.
And the belief that Black teachers had in their students, they didn't believe they were stupid, and you couldn't get away with not doing your homework. You couldn't get away with those things. You couldn't get away with missing school. And we had a sister here, Miss Jackson, who came from the South, was a certified teacher. She had to take a job at one of the local factories because they wouldn't let her in the school district. Silly things like that. So
she had to show her picture on the first. She told me this story. Her first application, she had to have a picture of herself on that application.
Yeah. I was at work, and I was at Armstrong, but she couldn't. She had to be a janitor. She was a certified teacher. So those things. Bored of it. So often people think, well, you know, what are people still arguing about? We did this, we did that. Well, they didn't always benefit us. Sometimes they benefited other people more than they benefited us. And so I'm one of those persons. I'm saying to folks, you know, I don't mind living around you, but I don't have to. You know, and I know my kid doesn't have to go to school with you, because he's not going to be smarter because he goes to school with you. He's going to be what happens with the teacher that he has. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah. And the other thing, Reverend Bailey, is all those Black teachers, all those Black professionals, when they integrated, who do you think the white school district hired? They didn't have positions for the Black teachers. No. So if there was 20 Black teachers in the Black school and you integrate, they had nowhere to go. They now were working as, you know, in people's homes or going into the factories. So it wiped out an entire generation of Black professionals, just like that. That's Brown v. Board. So there was a question here about what the name of the podcast is. I will try and get that. Julie, if you're listening and you can text that to me. I think it was one from Malcolm Gladwell, but I'm not entirely sure. But we will get the name of the podcast, because it is fascinating to listen to the unintended consequences of Brown v. Board, particularly on teachers, Black teachers. So let's try and get through the 60s here, and then we'll get to questions and answers. You know, the 60s is just like hand-to-hand combat. I mean, most folks now on this call probably were born by the end of the 1960s, mid-1970s, although I know there's a lot of younger people as well. But folks, this is an ancient history, and this is all tied into, you know, the beginning of our country, Reconstruction, the end of Reconstruction, and then you have Jim Crow, and now there's this second kind of Reconstruction. So there are folks that are sitting in Woolworth stores at the lunch counter because they couldn't get served. You have the Freedom Riders, where because you couldn't take a bus into the South, you had these young people who were trying to force the issue. March on Washington, 1963, Martin Luther King. I mean, this is a historic struggle of trying to trying to get back to where we were at with Reconstruction. I mean, think about it. There was a question about how did Black people get elected? Well, they could vote. During Reconstruction, you had the federal government allowing full participation of Black people. And when that occurred, they got to be in power. Once that ended, they lost their ability to have any power. And now we're to the 1960s, and it's just one struggle after the other. And we have violence going on. So 1963, members of the KKK still have the KKK going on. They plant bombs in the church of a Black church, and they kill 4 young children. I mean, this is the kind of violence that we are seeing. George Floyd was a terrible thing that happened. Understand that is not an isolated incident. The only reason we have the outrage we do is because of cell phones. That was not the first time that has happened, folks. That has happened repeatedly. And we just don't see it. And trust me, if it's a white cop's word against a Black man, you know who's going to win that argument. So it's the videotape is the only difference. In the mid-1960s, we finally get federal laws that require private parties, hotels, restaurants, these aren't government entities, to allow Blacks to use and have their services. I mean, think about that. Up until the 1960s, hotels could say, I'm sorry, but you can't stay here because you're Black. Somebody who owned an apartment could say, I'm not renting it to you. Somebody who had a restaurant said, I don't want you in here. There was a big push for voter registration because remember, like I said before, it comes back to, our whole system comes back to voting. If you can't vote, if you cannot participate in a democracy, then you are not going to be able to have your full rights as citizens. And so if you are part of the power structure, you want to keep people from voting. And so there was a big push here to try and get Black people to register, to try and get them the ability to vote.
And Philadelphia, if you can go back to that, Philadelphia, Mississippi is a very important city for white supremacy. And it was one of the places where Reagan kicked off his campaign, Philadelphia, Mississippi. And what people forget is that there's a lot of history around Philadelphia, Mississippi, and the state of Mississippi itself. And it's, you know, so a lot of times people don't see these symbols that people make. But as an African American, you have to be very clear when somebody does something. So somebody says, well, why didn't you vote for X, Y, and Z? Well, he started his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Or he ran a campaign stop in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Who would from the West go to Philadelphia, Mississippi for anything? Even if he didn't start his campaign there, why would you even go? It's a big statement that's made. It's like when people say, when they start looting, we're going to start shooting, and I'm out here for your Second Amendment right. I know what that says. That says it's open season. For those of you who have guns, so I'm supporting your Second Amendment right. Had nothing to do with George Floyd, the brother who got killed. Well, what does that have to do with a statement? So it's a dog whistle that's sent out. And if you're African American, you have to hear it. And other people will say to me, I didn't hear that. No, you didn't hear it because you're so used to it being said that you don't even recognize it, nor does it move you. When I hear the President of the United States say, I'm defending your Second Amendment rights, after he said, if they start looting, we start shooting. And as if America hasn't looted people. It looted the whole nation. So it's just amazing. So those dog whistles people send out, and they don't even think they're being racist. Oh, that's not racist. It is. Ask a white supremacist what Philadelphia, Mississippi means to them.
Well, and it goes to part of what we're trying to accomplish here. Know your history. Know the history of this country. So when Ronald Reagan starts his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, you know what that means. So, you know, the South has used police brutality forever, right? So we just glossed through Reconstruction, but you know, trust me, there was massacres of Black folks trying to participate that happened throughout the South, and of course in the North as well. So, you know, here you have peaceful demonstrators marching for voting rights, because remember, at this point, you still have these crazy laws. You have these literacy tests. You have these poll taxes. Black folks still can't vote freely. They can't register because of all these crazy state laws that prevent them from fully participating. So in 1965, we finally get the Voting Rights Act. 1965. Until then, you could have, I mean, Google one of these literacy tests. They're impossible to pass. You're not going to pass it. And basically it said the federal government is now going to oversee how states run their elections to be sure that they are not preventing Black people from voting or others based on these thinly veiled tests or taxes that essentially discriminate against Black people. This is happening today. Florida just amended their state constitution to allow felons who have served their time to vote, which is a big deal. We're not even going to get a chance to get into mass incarceration and what that means. And what did the state legislative body in Florida do? They said, well, before anybody who was in prison and now served their sentence, before they can vote, they're going to have to pay all these fines, and nobody could tell them how much fines they owed. And the federal court recently struck it down as unconstitutional. This notion of trying to disenfranchise Black voters is a constant theme throughout the entire history of our country, starting from Reconstruction and going right through today. You must understand it. When people say we can't do this or that because of voter fraud, the only reason they're saying that, I shouldn't say the only because that might be too strong, but there's something under the surface, and it's trying to keep somebody from voting. And that's the thing we have to understand in terms of the history of our country. Fair Housing Act, this is the first federal law that now says you can't tell somebody that you can't buy a house because you're Black. I mean, I was born in 1968, so this is my lifetime. And think about the consequences of the history of this country and all of these laws on the ability for the Black community to acquire wealth, to acquire political power, to be involved. You basically have taken 300 years and now finally have given them some rights, and it's still a struggle. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's the last slide, but that summarizes the first three sessions. I do have a question here, and then I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing this, and I'm gonna have Hannah turn everybody's video back on. But there's a question here that says, do you think Black people born in this era are still afraid to register to vote?
I will answer that. And still in many places, people are afraid to vote. And especially now, with the states' rights being on the rise again, people do take their life in their hand. And if it's not just your life, it's the social standing. You lose a job, all kinds of things. And it's not only in the South. So many Black folk were voting according to whatever city they lived in, because you knew you didn't. You couldn't get a job. You couldn't go anywhere else. So even if they didn't believe in the politics, they voted. And it's still there. It's still there. And that history in our mind is what works against us sometimes. You didn't hit it earlier, but in the South, Black folk would not drink Pepsi Cola or Coca-Cola in the South. They would reach for the great. They could not buy a Coke or Pepsi. It wasn't a law in the books, but you knew you couldn't buy a Coke or a Pepsi. That's how bad it was. So that's why so many of them, when they came north, they started drinking Pepsi and Coke, because they were not allowed to drink it in the South, because people thought that Coke was cocaine in it when it first started. So people thought that would make them go wild. So those kind of things, and a lot of things that Blacks still feel, you know, and you got to work against it, and even in your own mind, you got to fight against not listening to that, cop pulling up on you, things like that. Go ahead, Daniel.
Sorry, Rev, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I think that's a whole nother piece that we have not touched on, and I don't even know where the time would even begin. But there's the trauma associated with this space. I think that's been largely ignored by our country. That the historical trauma, and then culturally how African Americans or Blacks, we carry our history. That's part of who we are. It's part of our culture. It's part of what we're proud of authentically. But there's a trauma tied to all that. And so I am my brother, I am my sisters, and it goes back. I am my mother, I am my grandmother. And so that experience we carry with us everywhere. And that go ahead, I'm sorry.
I'll say one more thing on it. So many whites always ask me, so when are you going to get over slavery? I've never felt bad about slavery. It's always the things that I've encountered in my lifetime. Those are the things. Like when somebody would say to me, you're not like the rest of them, they don't know the rest of them. Things like that. Or you're a little bit different. Those kind of things. So it's not the experiences that my father and mother went through, even though that trauma is passed down in my psyche, but it's more to protect me than it is to do anything else. And so, but it's there. I'm conscious of it every day. White people don't think about being white until they walk into a Black church or a Black community. I think about being Black 24/7. And I guarantee you this, when white people are talking to me, they recognize that I'm Black 24/7. So that's, and we've got to move somewhere beyond that as a nation and recognize what's going on. So often people do not. And have these kind of conversations. Really, it's a one-way conversation, but you'll get a chance if you come to the small groups to talk about these. But yeah, still today, racism is local. I'm not battling racism in the South. That's why I keep saying in the North. They had segregated counters here in Lancaster. People could not go into the lunch counters and eat in Lancaster. Not South Philadelphia, not South Philadelphia, Mississippi, but Lancaster. Some kids couldn't go to certain schools in Lancaster. School building that we own is where most of the Black kids went. This was the area that they lived on certain streets in Lancaster. And so it's here as well, and we might as well deal with it. If you go downtown, you can see it. Friday night was not for the people who live in the city. It never was built for the folk in the city. When you ride down on First Friday, you'll see what's meant for us. So it's still here.
Other questions? I do have this. Let me just say, if you go to our website and look under the resources tab, we have an excellent reference sheet of many resources that I think for those of you who are interested, you'll find extremely helpful. Podcasts, books, articles. If you want to dig deeper, I would just tell all my white friends out there, it's up to us to dig into this. We need to learn about it. And if you like podcasts, there's some great podcasts out there. There's some good books. Learn about our history. Understand, you know, I've been thinking a lot about this this George Floyd situation, his death, the protesting, and I have mixed feelings about it, because while change often comes through this type of action and it's important, this is something that's been going on for a long time. And, you know, a white police officer killing a black man is not new. And it's like, where were we? Where have we been? And where are we going to be a year from now? And I think that's something that we have to think about and challenge ourselves. I struggle with knowing what to do. And I think one thing that we can do is certainly learn about our history, understand what's going on. Getting involved is important too. But remember, you know, one rally's good, but what are you going to do next week? What are you going to do next month? And those are the tough things that I'm struggling with. How do we figure this out? Look at our history. This has been a fight. Folks, this isn't like, oh, today now we have a fight on our hands. This has been occurring from the beginning of the founding of our country. It's just we don't really know about it because it doesn't affect us. In terms of that podcast, my wife texted to me, and I think it's called Revisionist History, Season 2, Episode 2. It's on revisionisthistory.com, and we can try and put that up on our website as well. Other questions, thoughts? Reverend Bailey and Danielle, I'd be interested in your reflections on current events. And
well, I don't even want to go there. What I want to say, I'm just amazed that we kept 62 people out of 74, I think we had. I'm just amazed that because you being on a video, you could have just went anywhere. So it's not like we had you captivated in a church building. So I'm just amazed that many people were willing to stay and have the conversation. And I even see people that I know personally, neighbors, which is even better yet, to see that. Because one of the things I asked one of my neighbors, this is just personally, said to me, he was voting for Donald Trump. And I asked him why. He said, and I don't want to get into politics. He said, because I believe in the original Constitution. And I said, well, you know, an original Constitution had me as 3/4 of a man. He said, I still believe in it. So what am I supposed to take from that? That he believes for 3/5 of a man. So to see neighbors on here tonight is a blessing. And I think it tells me that all you folks stayed. Excellent.
For me, it's, I'm all over the place. I'm up, I'm down, you know. I think I'm, you know, processing a few of the incidents. The Amy Cooper incident actually hit me very hard because that highlighted the reality that we face as Black folks, that as a white person, I can run tell that, and no matter what I say, you know, you might be put in an awkward situation. And I, you know, I wonder if this Black man from the Central Park incident didn't fit a counter stereotype, you know, if he had a tattoo, or if he wasn't a you know, a writer from Harvard, or if he wasn't bird watching.
Hey, Danielle, can you just explain what the incident you're referring to? I'm assuming most people know, but.
Amy Cooper was in an area in Central Park in which people were supposed to bird watch. And so the guy, Cooper, his name was, I forget his first name, his last name was Cooper as well, not related to her, asked her to leash her dog. And then she went on and just kind of lost it and made a statement that she was going to call the cops and let the cops know that a Black man was trying to harm her.
African American.
And he began to video tape her saying these things, but she just completely just went up. I mean, it was like, push of a button, and she decided that's where she was going to go, very comfortably so. I think that's the piece. It was a very comfortable go there. And while he videotaped it and people were outraged, I just wonder, and I've had this conversation with, you know, friends who've been in spaces where they've been told on, and the reaction and how they've managed to deal with it. You know, looking at the deaths of these men, you know, and Breonna Taylor, I can't help but put myself in that space. I'm a woman who lives in a city. You know, what would happen if that would be mistaken identity? I have 3 African-American sons. I have an African-American fiance. I have African-American brothers who've been brutalized by the police. So this is hard. It's hard because it's just running and running and running, and every day. And like I said, in my career, this is what I do every day. This is my life's work. I get up every day to fight for our children that are minoritized, that are given less than. And so this has been a very hard space for me to make sense of. I think, you know, I was listening to someone the other day and they said, you know, seeing our future as African Americans means that we have to become fugitives of our present. And sitting with that reality, and I know I'm not the first one. You look at the historical context, but just sitting with that concept that is the space that I have to live in order to see future for the children, the families, for the people that we serve every day. So for me, it's just, I'm on a roller coaster of emotions, if that could sum it up.
And the only bad thing about that incident is that young lady, a company that she was working with, spent billions of dollars on training on how to deal with race and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't work. That stuff doesn't work because people don't have to deal with real things. So what people have to do is what you're doing tonight. Visit a Black church and be a minority for once. Don't lock your door when you see a Black person out in the grocery store. They're not going to rob your car, and those kind of things. But people have to feel, and I'm a Christian, so I love the idea that Jesus left heaven to be in our midst, took on our form, came like we were. I think that's what's missing. We've allowed people to make us believe there's a difference. Race is a construct. There is no such thing as a Black race or white race. But somehow we've been taught that, and we believe that. If I bleed you and you bleed, we're going to bleed the same color. I can give you a transfusion. Some people could use my heart and my lungs and anything else. So there is no such thing as race. We're all of the human race. And that's where people need to begin thinking. And if we can get people to think that way, and not let people divide one another on these little silly things, it's going to be a much better nation that we live in. But it begins, as I said to people, in your own home. You know, we got to get this stuff to our own kids. Our children should not have to carry this burden. Our grandchildren should not. And I'm not talking about Black children. To have children have to carry the burden of sitting out watching a Black man being lynched and people sitting around having a cookout at the same time. No child should carry that memory. No child. And it traumatizes all of us if we don't deal with this. I can't imagine if you showed that picture of that cop with his knee on the Black man's neck, if you showed that to a child, that would traumatize a child. I can't believe any child would be so insensitive that would affect them. So we can't allow things like that to happen because it takes away our humanity. And so that's the thing that bothers me the most, is that when we become so inhumane, that not only do we not care about what we see on those shows, we don't care what we see, what happens to other people. So white women can be missing. Got whole shows about white women being missing, and nobody's doing anything. I said to somebody just yesterday, the most dangerous place for a white sister is the college campus, but nobody says anything about that. Nobody talks about how they can be raped and everything else by people on the college campus, and nothing is done about it. So when you stop looking at one person as a human, it started spreading to other areas. My problem is that people don't see that other areas is spreading because they can't see what's happening to a person that does not look like them. I'm sorry, I'm preaching now.
No, that's all right, Reverend. I have a couple questions. I want to just clarify one thing on that podcast dealing with Brown v. Board and the effect it had on Black teachers. It is Revisionist History Season 2, Episode 3. I think I may have said Episode 2. So it's Episode 3. Again, we'll try and put that up in our resources tab. A couple questions that have come in.
I think we ought to say too, Dwight, that if anybody's staying past 7:30, that's you're on your time. We were going to cut it off. We're glad to have you.
It's 8 o'clock.
I don't want you to do like my members say, Rev preached so long you kept me in church. No, if you're here tonight.
That's the truth.
Here because then I'm going to get you for that. Because we're making you stay. And you won't use this to say, well, I can't come back because they go on too long.
Yeah.
So you're released if you want to be released.
That's fine. If you need to, if you're done, that is fine. We are just into the question and answers, and we're happy to continue. But absolutely, we're a half an hour beyond our end time. So I'm going to read this question. It says, don't we need to get more Black people to vote and get them into office to help change policy? I'll take a crack at answering that. Yes, of course. That's what we had a taste of that in Reconstruction, right? We had 10 years where South Carolina, the state legislative body, was run by Blacks, okay? And then after the end of Reconstruction, the right to vote was essentially taken away, notwithstanding the 15th Amendment. So the answer to that question is, of course, absolutely, but it's a struggle. Yeah. Let me see another question. A Black businessman in today's paper said this: it is no longer good enough to not be racist. What we need for you is to act against it, speak against it, fight against it, push out against it. When you are complacent, you are complicit.
I think that speaks to systems, Dwight, that, and kind of, you spoke to that and Rev spoke to that, when he talked about the signs in the South, right, that said Blacks or for whites only. You clearly saw. So if I run up against someone who clearly says to me, I don't like you, I have a choice on how I deal with that. And that's an individual person, but I can go about my day. But when there are systems and there are institutions that perpetuate the racism, we have to be accountable to those things. I need more than you saying you have Black friends. I need more than you having Black neighbors. It has to be about disrupting the systems and the institutions that are perpetuating this. That's how everything that you created in your slides told the story of systems. And I'm believing it was intentional, because that's around disrupting systems. You talked briefly about the KKK, but KKK was a system of hate. You have individual members, but it's a system of hate. So I think we have to really understand that it's so much bigger than that little piece.
It's unfortunately in our DNA. We have to understand as a country, it's in our DNA. Our Constitution protected slavery. So we just can't think that somehow this is a historical situation that we've outgrown. And I agree. It's there's another question here. Changing the culture takes time. What are practical steps that begin to move the needle? Let
me answer that, Dwight. How much time do we need? We've been here 400 years. And when I was a kid, I'm 70 years old now. Brother Rich told me that I'm a kid, but I'm 70 years old. And when I was a kid, my mother used to tell me that it'll be a better day. She won't see what we're seeing now. And I'm 71 years old and I'm seeing it today. And And part of the reason why it doesn't change, because there's three of us talking, and I don't like not letting you dialogue because we need to hear what you think about what we said tonight. You want to think what made you think, or what surprised you, and those are the things. If we can get those from people, getting people to think. I'm a Christian, so Jesus wanted them to make disciples. Disciples are students, people who learn, who think. What we have done in the Christian church, at least, we've made believers who believe that I need to love my neighbor, but they don't know how to do it because they're not thinking about ways of loving my neighbor the same way I love myself. We need thinkers, not believers, and most of the time believers get in trouble. So I really would like to hear what a few of you thought about tonight.
Well, Hannah, you want to turn off the, I don't know if you have a secret switch, but if people want to unmute and anybody has a comment, let's go for it.
Oh, sure. Yep, I can turn on people's audio. Give me 2 seconds here. Also, just as a personal note, that Revisionist History podcast is fantastic. All of the episodes, the way he looks at history is very thought-provoking.
And I will also say on our website, the Seeing White podcast goes through a lot of history. It is unbelievable. I re-listen to it every time I'm driving or taking a trip. Ask my kids, they get tired of it. They're like, you're not going to listen to that again, are you?
I'll go ahead and speak up. Alan Miller. I'm just very grateful for the opportunity to be together with the group this evening. The material that you presented, Dwight, was very helpful, but I especially appreciated Danielle and Reverend Bailey sharing their thoughts, their stories, their pain. I just really feel that's something that we need to hear, and we need to find more space in which to do that.
Thank you.
Jane Ellen Reed here. First, I want to thank you very much. This evening has been wonderful, and it's not necessarily, my college major was history, so I'm fascinated by history, and I really appreciate the fact that you have looked over so much time. I think one of the things I'm most interested in, and I'm looking forward to it, and I think in the small groups that might be what we expect, but I would really like to know what we can do now. You know, if we understand the history, which I think is really important to that foundational piece, but what do we do now? Is that going to be part of the small group conversations?
I can answer that, Dwight, if you want. Yeah, so that is the goal, to really wrestle with some of the historical pieces and really kind of interrogate our thinking and say, okay, so what does my everyday look like? And how does my everyday perpetuate or disrupt racist systems? I mean, that really kind of is the biggest piece. I think that's what you're asking, and we have to really kind of sit with that. What does my everyday look like? What do I do every day, and how do I, harm or heal? I think I feel like I live in those spaces. Am I doing something to harm, or am I doing something to heal? And so in order to do that, I have to kind of get very metacognitive in that process, think about my own thinking and my behaviors. And hopefully the questions that are created, I'm going to vet them between Dwight and Rev, help us do that.
And I would say too that I try not to make it a we. It's what am I going to do? And how am I going to take the information that comes into my head and take that information and let it transform me or radicalize me? And when I say radicalize, I'm not talking about some crazy person. I'm talking about moving me out of my comfort zone, do what I need to do, and not wait for other people. I used to say to brothers when they would call a sister out of their name, they would call a tramp or something like that, I would stop them in a minute. They would say, well, she's just a prostitute on the corner. Well, what she is not what she's doing doesn't determine who she is. So I have to respect her for who she is, not for what she's doing. And I think we can get that concept in our head. That, I'm not going to treat you as a Black person. I can have a lot of hatred in my heart for white people. I did at one time. And I was correct in what I did, but I realized that hurt was, that anger and hate was going to destroy me. And so I had to do something about it. And that meant that I had to put myself in their shoes as well and begin seeing what responsibility I had on making a change. And I think that if we can take our own responsibility, not wait for somebody, we are thinking people. We're thinking people. We could send people to the moon. There's no reason why we can't change. Because we're thinking people. If we could think, not operate on my belief, but operate on our thinking. So it's not a we thing when it has to be an individual thing. Because if you wait for somebody else, they may not move as fast. They need to move quicker.
I would just add one thing too, and I agree with what Danielle and Reverend Bailey said. But when I look back at history and I look at Reconstruction, the only reason that happened was because the radical Republicans had a veto-proof margin in Congress. You had a president that's vetoing every civil rights legislation that's coming through. And you also have to understand the way this system is structured. You have a United States Supreme Court who gets to decide what the Constitution means. It's not hard to figure out from a big picture system level that it is really hard to change these systems. I mean, I think there might be a window, depending on what happens in the next 6 months, for meaningful reform through the legislative process. It's a very small hope, but I mean, if you think about the change, it's a combination, in my opinion, of people taking a lot of risk, going out there and fighting for justice and having the right things come together to make big system change. And Reconstruction was one of those times. If the radical Republicans wouldn't have been there, we would not have the 14th Amendment, which is the most important amendment in our Constitution. I mean, it could have gone another way. So it is hard, Jane. I struggle with your question, which is, what do we do and how much longer do we have to wait to actually make change? Other comments or questions?
Yes, I would like to make a comment. My name is Donna Bronner. And first of all, I want to say thank you for this platform. I'm so grateful that this has occurred and that I was led to be a part of this. And one reason is because it was great information, but to see whites and blacks on this platform, I think is a first step. I'm an educator and I have been invited into a conversation tomorrow, but it was a conversation that my superintendent called and said, all the blacks, we need a space. And my question was, where are the whites? Because they need to be a part of that space. So I'm gonna start, I had so much to say. I was typing in the chat box like crazy. And like you, Danielle, I had a lot of feelings. I've been crying off and on. I've been praying. But one thing I do believe is that this needed to happen for something to happen. And I'm gonna start by piggybacking off of the comment that Mr. Yoder made. He said, this is bigger, this is deeper. I truly believe this is deeper. It goes all the way back to what you said, the slavery trade. This is a spirit of hatred, and it is about the DNA. I'm going to use that because you use that. We have to take individual responsibility, like Reverend Bailey said. It starts with us, because the Word of God says and I'm going to use the word because I believe in God. I'm a minister, and it says Proverbs 4:23. It says, "Watch your heart with all diligence, for from it flows the springs of life, or the issues of life." And so these seeds were from the beginning. The superiority belief is a seed. And so it goes back to taking responsibility for your own belief. Once we get this knowledge, this history, then now what are we going to do with it? We have to do something with it. So we have to make a decision. Am I going to change my heart? I heard the Reverend say, I hated them at one time, but I couldn't continue to hate. So we have to make a decision. Do we continue to walk in the spirit of hate or superiority? Or do we say, this is not the way, because we see it does not glorify God, nor does it have value for each other, yourself or other man. And so once we change ourselves and our families, starting in the home with our own mindset, with our own heart issues, then it will spread out to the systems. But definitely the systems need to be changed. I'm going to say that even in a Christian school, I have 3 children, 2 African-American male sons and 1 daughter. They all have encountered the law in some way and was mistreated for whatever reason. But I put them all in Christian schools. And even in the Christian schools, in the name of Jesus, we experienced this kind of prejudice and hatred. And I thought I was shielding my kids by putting them in the schools. I was trying to give them the best education. And we encountered that more so with the boys than anything. And so that was one system. I also work in the education system like Danielle, and I have worked in the city of Chicago and now in a really nice suburb. In this suburb, there is no equality. People make a decision not to teach the African-American kids. They don't give them the same education, even in the same classroom. They refuse to modify. They dumb down the work, and then parents come and rally for their kids to have the higher classes, which takes the white kids and put them in a separate math, a separate class, all the classes. They get the honors classes, and predominantly Blacks are still in the regular classes, and the teachers, who are predominantly white, they don't teach them. They don't want to. I heard a statement that said that one of the speakers said it was better to be segregated than it was to be integrated. And I believe that. I'm from Mississippi. I'm saying a whole lot. Please forgive me, y'all. I'm from Mississippi, and I was born in the 60s. It was the most scariest, horrific time in my life. I couldn't wait to get away from there. But when they integrated my school, we were so hurt. Some of us were happy because we thought we were getting a better education, but really we had the best in our own little segregated schools, because the teachers cared about us. They loved us. We saw those teachers in church. We saw those teachers in our community. It was truly a village raising the child. And we saw so many kids succeed and go on to be great because they had that. We talk about something we say in education. Danielle, you can vouch for me. We say you have to have an expectation for these kids. Well, the white teachers don't have the same expectation for our kids that Black teachers do. And so you see this repeating itself even in the students. They're kicked out of the classes. They're put in the special ed classrooms. And I got to work with those kids, trying to be a bridge between, a liaison between the parents and the teachers to help those students cross over and not have to be put in special ed. We had what was called, it was at risk was the big term back then. And they were putting all the kids in special ed. And so I was hired to do that, to kind of help with that. It's just so much, the systems, the courts that keep our young men, fathers, brothers locked up. And all I hear is continuance. They never try to fight for them. They throw them in and they let them sit and wait. And it's just so many things that are wrong. And I believe that this is a time that God has allowed to bring change. So I would hope and pray that as a result of this, because this is heavy, seeing somebody's life being taken like that. And it has happened so many times. Thank God for technology. I made that comment. Thank God for technology, because we do have some recourse. But even with that, sometimes we don't get justice. So, I mean, I have a lot to say. I have a lot of emotions. And it's just my husband, my sons, all have felt this so very deeply. And I think that change has to come. It has to. We cannot let this be for naught at this moment with all of what's going on as a result. We cannot. So I would ask that you say, what can we do? Take individual responsibility and begin to, I think, Danielle, you used a word, you said grapple or wrestle with, whatever, what you used a term. I would hope that we would take what we have now and begin to evaluate our beliefs, our values, what we really think, and face those areas that are blinded to us, where we think, you know, we're superior. And so I'm gonna stop there, because I'm beginning to, I don't want to ramble, because I am emotional about this, but justice has to come, and I'm calling for it. I am calling for it. I'm speaking it out, because the one thing I got from God is begin to call those things that be not as though they were. So I'm glad those millennials are calling for justice. It has to happen now, because they're bold, and it has to happen. So I'm believing that it will. I'm gonna try to be a part of whatever God says to be a part of, to make that change in my community.
Excellent.
Thanks, Donna.
I think Jill had a question. Jill?
Yeah. Well, if I could just, in relation, or to give feedback to the question, what can we do now? I would just encourage all of us to Google the characteristics of white supremacy culture. Just looking at those characteristics can help us see what we all swim in, and we're all involved in some sort of organization, whether it be just a local community or a church or a job. But if we work to at least recognize what characterizes white supremacy culture, we can then we have plenty to do, even in our everyday life. And then in addition, working on implicit bias, my own implicit bias. So those are the two things that I'm focusing on in the here and now today.
And I think, Jill, just adding that, you have to give yourself permission to be uncomfortable and to face, that. Because like she said, the fish should be less to discover water. You're in it. You don't even know it. And when you become clear about it, it's like, okay, so what do I do now? Well, that's going to be an uncomfortable space, because it's going to require some level of changing patterns or habits. And that, that's challenging. And it's challenging for some of us, just the idea of change. But it's not, tomorrow I'm going to volunteer at the local food bank. It's bigger than that. And I think one of the things I want to add, because I presented myself and I spoke from a lens in saying that I was an African American female. My mother was white. And she was a white woman in Lancaster City. And I had a moment yesterday when I took my 19-year-old son to vote for the first time. And I stood there and I looked at him and I remembered my mother every voting time. Every time there was a vote, she worked them polls from 8 to 8. 8 to 8. And I remember her saying to me, I was about 5 years old and I started to understand or be told about this concept of race. And I said, Mom, you tell me that I'm Black, but you're white and I don't understand. And she said, I need you to understand. And it may not be the exact words, but what she said to me was, every day you wake up, you will be a Black woman. I need you to see the beauty in that. I'll still be your mother, but I need you to see that. And so as a white woman, she did a lot. And I think part of the reason why I'm in this space is because of who she was. So, and she always was very clear that she's a white woman. She never tried to deviate from that space and never tried to act as if she was anything but that. But because of her and her everyday moments, I think I'm able to have clarity and to fight in this space. So don't ever minimize what you can do. I think, but understand that you're doing is going to be uncomfortable if it's really going to make a change.
I think Jennifer had a question. Jennifer?
First of all, just thank you, everyone. I've just found everything very helpful. And just going back with some of the last two questions, I think I have children that are about elementary age. And I'm wondering how I should raise, what resources you might have that you might recommend, first of all. Second, I have two children, two boys, for whatever reason. I'm of mixed race. Their father is Caucasian. One came out appearing Caucasian, one actually came out looking curly hair and all, but like me. And I don't know if there's a different way to teach one child that might not experience the Black experience, whereas the other child may. And is there a different way? Should I teach them?
One thing you need to realize, during enslavement, the child's mother determined what race they were. That has not changed, except for when it's a Black child born to a white person. But if the mother is white, Black, a child is, don't care how white they look, what they look like. So you still have to raise that child as if he was as dark as I am, because somebody's going to find out he has a Black mother. And that's going to change the whole dynamics of what goes on. So you need to make sure they get the same kind of culture. I think people ought to be cross-cultural, but we learn white culture all the time. Very rarely do people teach their own culture to their children. There's nothing wrong with our culture. It's a part of the American fabric, even though right down to the hanging down of the pants below the behind. So you just have to be able to let them know that that's going to be important to them, because that's what he's going to be deemed as. And you don't want the lighter skinned brother separating from the darker skinned child, and that happens all the time. Because we know the lighter you are, the more privilege you end up gaining, and that goes back to enslavement as well. So persons found out if they had their own child, the so-called master would have children by the Black sister. He knew those children would be worth more. And so when they abolished slavery as far as the trafficking, it began doing it here in America. And many of those babies that were born in enslavement were born to white males. But they still were deemed Black because their mother was, no matter how fair they looked. So it's still nothing, slavery's not here, but the whole color system is still here. So you got to raise him as a Black child.
I would, and also when you were saying what resources to utilize, there are a lot of multicultural authors and writers of children's books that begin to help children, as I was saying, Donna, interrogate their thinking and just kind of begin to question different things and bring the question to light in a way that that is a sense of beauty and a sense of pride. You know, there are authors who have main characters of books and or characters that display different positive traits, which is different than some of the resources that we've used in education. If you Google some multicultural authors, you can find some, and then I could actually share some with Dwight. I can get some lists and share some with Dwight to share because just in full, I taught math. Literacy is what I'm learning. I was a math teacher, but I have friends that have a wealth of knowledge around what those resources are, and I have some I use for my sons. But what I came up with was very powerful. Esperanza Spalding has this song called Black Gold. Just that song I've played for my sons over and over again, and I continue to play it for them. I play it for my Black male students in my school. That song is very powerful, but it just sets the stage to understand who they are. It's just one resource. But when you said that, that's the first thing I played for my youngest son when he was born, because it had just come out. And I made my older son listen to it. So, but I will share some of those resources. If you're just looking for just children's books, there's a wealth of them, and I'll share some of Dwight that have been vetted, right? Because some people just write. But, yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
All right. My name is Bob Hewitt, and I really thank you all for putting this together. And I don't mean just tonight. I had attended one of the seminars months ago, and I just thank you for staying in the race and staying in the hunt, because you folks started doing this when the waters seemingly were calm. There were no incidents going on. So when people do that kind of thing, to me, that comes from the heart, and that's more of a mission than anything else. History is a tremendous teacher, but in order for history to teach its lessons, right, we have to remember that history. So it is so important, you know, Reverend Bailey and Sister Jackson and my man Dwight. It is so important what you are doing, because nobody said it, but I'll say it. We as Black people need to make sure that we know our history so that we can teach our history to our young. History is not about dead people. History is about us and those folks who are yet born, who are coming after us. Because if we don't know our history, and you've heard it said before, that we are doomed to repeat it. So, you know, and again, whether a child, I move just for a moment, whether a child is Black, white, or biracial. I've got 3 children. One is biracial. His mama is white. I'm, as you can see, a Black man, older than you, Pastor. But that's all right. We mature, you know, like good wine.
I just got a better barber.
I just look out. Hey, what you saying something about my beard? What? Anyway, okay, you got some hair. I see that. But if children live with criticism, they're going to learn to condemn. If children live with hostility, they're going to learn to fight. You know, if children live with ridicule, they'll learn to feel shy. If they learn with jealousy, they're going to learn to feel envy. If children learn with tolerance, they learn patience. If they live with praise, they learn appreciation. And I could go on, but what I'm saying here really is that whatever color the child happens to be, and I'm a proponent too, that there is no race. There is no race. Our body parts, if I pass, I'm a donor. They can use my eyes or whatever, put it in whomever. So it's really not about the outside. Yeah, we're aware of that, but it's really about the inside. I think too often, you know, with kids, we ask the wrong question. We ask, what do you want to be when you grow up? And everybody wants to be a professional, whatever. But the question really should be, you know, what kind of person do you want to be? And everybody that asks that question, what should we do? All of us have a sphere of influence. Everybody online, all of us, me and everybody else. And if sometimes we don't have to leave our own homes in terms of what we can do as individuals, in terms of how we teach others. We may not be the ones that have the voice, but we may know somebody that does, and we may be able to have impact on them to go out and shout the word. So there are things that all of us can do. And it's certainly not an either or thing in terms of individual racism or institutional racism. It is a both/and. And so there's a need for us to be willing and able to vote responsibly, because now we have the opportunity, we have the right, we have the privilege to be able to do that now. So responsible voting, that we would allow our voices to be heard, that we wouldn't let money stop us, because sometimes we're concerned about where the funding is going to come from. So we're not going to speak out and be honest and transparent. We have to move past that. But this is a tremendous piece that is being presented to us. And I think it's fantastic that people would stay online for this amount of time. But I'm wondering, and I always wonder this because this is not my first rodeo, I'm wondering who will be in the hunt next year? Who will be in the hunt in 2023? Who will be concerned about this when we're not emotional, as we all are at this point? I know as a Black man, I am. And I know, Pastor, you said that for kids, it would be traumatic to see that man's knee on that man's throat. I cried, and I'm a man, and I'm a man, and I cried. So it is something that's emotional. It is something that's not a one and done. That was the 44th person that I'm aware of over these past years, that has died at the hands of somebody through violence, unarmed, all of that. So this is different this time, because we are here talking about it. This is different this time, because if we don't do something this time, if we don't keep this baby moving this time, it's going to be worse the next time. It is like, and I say this and I hush, Pastor, it's like taking a Band-Aid and putting it on a deep wound on our knee that is infected, that is stinking, right? That is painful, right? That is debilitating, with the country being the patient that we're talking about. And if we think we can keep getting away from that, we are surely fooling ourselves. Period.
Thanks, Brother Bob. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Dwight.
I agree. I think we have a unique window here, and I just hope and pray that we see real change, because it's been a long, long journey through history, and you see how much we still have to accomplish. So other thoughts, comments?
Hey there.
Hey, Megan.
This is Megan Yoder. First of all, just wanted to congratulate my dad on figuring out how to do this on Zoom and figuring out the technology. He told me he had it under control, but I don't know. I was a little skeptical.
It wasn't me. It was Hannah.
It's Hannah, yeah. But Danielle, I wanted to thank you for your insights specifically around education, because I think, myself and I would imagine a lot of the other white folks listening are truly shocked at how much of this has been missed in our education and how much of this history we just have never been taught. And I saw a tweet recently that was asking people to consider what age were you when you had your first Black teacher? Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about that, and I was racking my mind, and for me it was college. It was an African American history class in college, and what a shame that it took so long to reach, to have that type of perspective. So I appreciate the work you're doing, and I hope that this is, education is very important. I hope that we can all take that away, and I hope that's something that can change in the future.
One of the things I did not say was that when I was in the 4th grade, there was a librarian, white librarian, who put Black books in the library so I could take them out to read. So people can do things. If they, we can't operate as if we don't see. This Sunday I'm preaching, open my eyes, Lord. It's more for me than against me. The people would just open their eyes, do a little research, a little bit of reading, and go beyond their beliefs, and do those things like Danielle said about finding those books for kids. Our bulletin, if you come to my church, our bulletin have Black faces on And it's not to, somebody, I had a guy come in and say, well, why do you got all black, why you got a black bulletin? He never said that when he went to a white church. Why do you have a white bulletin? But he thought something was wrong with mine. And what I'm saying to him, Jesus could not have looked like that. He wasn't born in the Middle East, he's born in Northeast Africa. Somehow people have carved it out of Africa and made it Asia, or somewhere hanging in between. So we just gotta begin telling the truth about whatever it is. Just tell the truth, not sugarcoat it. And my brother was right. I have a hard time in my church. I've lost members because of how I take a stand on loving yourself and loving your neighbor. And people just, this is something, so many people think if I'm saying that somehow I got to hate white people to love myself. That's just crazy to believe that. And black folk in our community, not everybody, there's some who believe that if you love me, if I love being black, that's saying I don't like white people. That's just crazy. And we can't have that mindset. So there's teaching on both sides that has to happen. Because you see the dearth of black folk that's on this. Because they're tired of talking about it. They don't believe it's going to change anything. They don't think anything's going to be any different. And next week, people are going to go right back to doing what they've done. And I've been here 26 years telling people we can change. We can make a change. We can work it out. There's a God in heaven. We can do something about it. The thing is, will we stick with it? And so it's got a lot of education on both sides. And you can't believe the stuff that you got in school. I thought it was the Boston Tea Party that made the revolt against the English. And I found out it was slavery. It had nothing to do with the Boston Tea Party. Nobody told us that in school, that the United States was upset with no taxation on the enslavement and the sale of blacks. That's a big part of the revolt. Nobody said that the first couple of presidents we had were all owned enslaved people. Nobody's taught us that. So we need to bring that stuff out of the closet, put it at the forefront so people can know what we are as Americans. And I have a lot of faith in this nation. I had a lot of faith in this nation. I wrote an editorial one time because somebody said Barack Obama didn't love America. He loved America differently. I said, no, black people love America. We love America, even though it hasn't loved us. We love America. And we'll fight for it, we'll die for it, we'll do all kinds of things because we love America. We're not trying to go back to Africa. We love America. And so, and put up with all the stuff that America has done to black people. We've died in every war, pay our taxes, go to jail to pay other people's taxes, and we still love America. And that I'm hoping that there are other people who love the United States enough to say we can't survive like this. A house divided cannot stand. And we're divided as a house. That white supremacists who can march, and somebody says the president of the United States, there's good people on both sides. We can't have that. It should be an outrage that somebody would say that somebody is walking around who's a terrorist organization. It's been a terrorist organization historically that nobody's done anything about. Many of the kids who are marching with the black kids who are marching, or black kids who are upset about what happened to their brother Taylor, many of those folk are anarchists. They're sitting out there, kill the police, all that kind of stuff. And the black kids are the ones who are going to get blamed for it. They don't get blamed for the riots when we know in the 60s, I may go on a little bit long, in the 60s, when we were out marching peacefully, all of a sudden somebody would say, let's throw a brick. And half the time they wanted anybody who was in the plan, they were not in the group, but we found out they were paid government informants. The other people were the ones who put the drugs in our community. So where every time we got ready to turn around, all of a sudden you see, got all this free reefer. Where did this come from? Nobody knew. Cocaine, nobody knew. But we've got to do better than that. We can't allow the forces that be that allow this to go on because they benefit, the 1% benefits from it. We can't allow that. Otherwise, we're not going to have a nation at all. And if the kids start rioting and burning up things, it works right into the plan of what people want to do, to go back to martial law, everything else. And if you can't see it, I don't care what your politics are, if you can't see it, then it's just, we're blinded. We love America, we got to take off the blindfolds because we will not be a nation going the way we're going. This won't be. at all. And we went back to the 1860s in our politics and everything else. It's crazy. The shining light on the hill was because of what America did with its race relations. That's why the Statue of Liberty is standing there, because it was a gift to America because of what they were doing with the abolition of slavery. And most people don't even know that.
Others. Well, I think maybe we come to an end. I want to thank everyone for participating. With Zoom, Hannah has showed me how I can see how many registrants we've had, and we had over 100. I was just thrilled because it made me realize that people are interested and care and want to find out what they can do. And I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to be here and learn and listen. We have a lot of resources on our website. I would strongly encourage you to go there, do some reading, listen to the podcast. It's just been really, really interesting and helpful for me as a white person to be able to understand our history more deeply. And I think in some ways, it's become much more complicated in terms of how I see the world and what I do. But in other ways, it's become much clearer. The world makes more sense. I understand now why, there's no grocery stores in Lancaster City. I mean, there's a historic reason for that. It's kind of crazy. So there is the small groups that are going to occur in 2 weeks. You're welcome to join or sign up for that. We just ask that again, you take the time to do the extra reading. Danielle or Reverend Bailey, do you have anything else? Final words?
We'll do better with timing next time.
Sorry, Reverend makes me laugh sometimes.
But because I always tell my folk, you can't get anything done without time. And time was made for us. We weren't made for time. Time was made for us. And if you don't spend the time wisely, and I think we have tonight, you have to take the time. It's going to take time. So I appreciate being here tonight. I appreciate the remarks that people gave, written as well as spoken. And I just thank you for staying. I said it earlier. This is why God sent me to Lancaster. And I've been here working on this, and you can ask anybody around. This is what I do, trying to get people to be reconciled. Because I believe God's given me a ministry of reconciliation, and we have to be reconciled. So I appreciate all of you who came on tonight. And I would say much.
And I would just say thank you. I'm completely humbled. When Dwight and Rev had asked me to engage in a conversation, I was completely humbled. I do believe, like he said, I think God's called me to be a disruptor of systems in whichever way he has me do it. So I just thank you for allowing me to share the space with you and to engage in a dialogue.
Your voice is really important, Danielle. Thank you.
And don't think you're going to get out of it. Right? They're saying nice things to us. I know, I can hear it.
Voluntold, Rev Voluntold. That's what he does. He voluntold
I voluntold you, right.
All right. Well, be safe, everyone. Thank you. If you want to get on our email list, you can email our gkhlaw@gkh.com email address, and we will add you. We do have an email list that deals directly with this seminar series. There was one question when we are going to do the 5th seminar. I anticipate that will probably be July or August, depending on where things are at with COVID-19. We'll likely have to continue to do those through the Zoom. but we are going to continue with the small groups and the seminar series. So if you're interested, we'll get you on that email list, and it'll also be on our website.
I think we also need to thank Hannah for the wonderful job that she did tonight.
Yes, Hannah.
Keeping us together. Thank you, Hannah.
Oh, sure. Thanks for having me.
Just buttering you up.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Good rest of your week.
Bye.
That's all.